Our sneak peek program for the new exhibit, Tiny, Charismatic Mini Fauna from the Permanent Collection. This exhibit really officially opens tonight with our mixed media program, so come back for that if you can. It starts at 6 p.m. and runs till 9 p.m. and there's activities, tours, food, drinks, music, so that should be a fun event. This exhibit is generously sponsored by Nancy and Dick Hollister and Stephanie Brennan, and we are very grateful to them. My name is Jane Lavino, and I'm the Curator of Education and Exhibits here at the museum. Tiny will be up all winter through April 22, if I got that right, about April 22, so come often. You will notice when we go in the exhibit that we are not quite officially ready to open. Some of the interpretive signage, like the animal silhouettes that will go along the baseboard, and some of the look closer, think bigger, explanatory interpretive text is still going up. So this is truly a sneak peek. Today's program is a little different than our normal, typical sneak peek programs in that it will last a full hour, from 11 to 12. We're going to be beginning with Adam Harris, who I'll introduce in just a moment in the exhibit, and then we'll be hearing from Amber Hall, who's our guest speaker in the exhibit, and then after about 20, 30 minutes in the exhibit, we'll be moving back into the members' lounge for maybe 20 minutes or so of fabulous slides of tiny animals. So let's start with Adam. Adam is going to give us a brief intro to the exhibit in the exhibit space.
Yeah, so let's go in there.
Adam, most of you know Adam, but he is our Peterson Curator of Art and Research, Dr. Adam Harris.
As Jane mentioned, when the museum collection began, it really focused on charismatic megafauna, big animals, primarily from this region. And then as we've grown over the last 30 years, the collection has grown as well to incorporate smaller creatures, creatures from different continents, etc. So animals from all over the world, and then hopefully a range of creatures that you would see in the natural kingdom. So I don't know if anyone else ever used this term before, mini fauna, but if not, I want credit for coining it. Because they are charismatic and they're tiny, so you've got chipmunks and you have marmots and all these little creatures that we love to look at, and certainly artists over time have enjoyed looking at them as well. What you'll see throughout this gallery is not too many huge, massive scale paintings of tiny animals. A few. There's a huge painting of prairie dogs down there that's one of our favorites. But these works of art would have been used for various purposes. Say the famous sculptor Alexander Calder went to the Bronx Zoo when he was a young man and practiced his artistic skills by quickly sketching different little animals. This is a shrew. So there's that kind of thing. There's some natural history type of things that would have been illustrations, but that today we regard very highly. This is a recent acquisition by a female artist from the 1700s who was widely and highly regarded for her artistic skills, and she's got ladybugs, spiders, butterflies, maybe a dragonfly in there on a beautiful thistle, so that's really worth taking a look at. That's probably the oldest piece in this exhibit, from 1750, we think. And then the most recent is from about 2011. It's loosely organized by categories that our Associate Curator Bronwyn Minton and our summer interns came up with. So there's squeak, buzz, swim, burrow, some fun categories for you to look at. And then there's life-size silhouettes, so they will be, these aren't quite done yet, along the ground, so you can compare how they actually compare in size. There'll also be some really interesting factoids on the columns when we get completely finished. So some surprising things in here, other than Alexander Calder and Regina Deutsch. There's 7 Picasso etchings in this exhibit, and there are 3 Robert Bateman pieces. There's 2 sketches, drawings, and 1 painting. And then there's 2 originals by John one original by John James Audubon and one original by John Woodhouse Audubon. So John James Audubon was the compiler of the Birds of America, really famous. He, after they finished the Birds of America, they went on to do a project about the mammals of North America. And so we have a nice little drawing of mice that he did. And then his son took over that project as John James Audubon went a little bit senile later in life. And so there's some brook minks by his son, John Woodhouse Audubon, in this exhibit. That's kind of the highlights and some things to come back for when we finish doing all this stuff. The other thing people always ask, and it's just a sort of a technical thing, is that in an exhibit like this where there's a lot of works on paper, we always keep the light levels really low, and that's because these lights and bright lights can sort of dim and diminish the works on paper over time. So we want these things to last for as long as humanly possible. So instead of just keeping them completely in the dark, we bring them out for a maximum of 6 months a year, and we keep them at this low light level so that future generations will be able to enjoy them as well. I'll stop there with the intro and let Jane introduce our featured speaker.
Great. So Ember is going to speak next. Ember Hall has a PhD in ecology and an MS in ecology and evolutionary biology. She's fascinated by the incredibly diverse ways in which organisms deal with environmental challenges. In particular, she researches how well animals can adjust to human-caused environmental change. Ember is a research scientist for the Wyoming Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit, and prior to joining the cooperative unit, she served as the research director for the Teton Research Institute at Teton Science Schools. Welcome, Ember.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you all for taking time out of your morning to be here. I'm going to provide some ecology and sort of natural history insights into some of the animals that have been so carefully featured in this exhibit. I should put out a disclaimer, I am not an artist by any stretch, so all art-related questions, hopefully we have experts that can help us with those. But my focus is certainly on the animals. So I wanted to highlight 3 of the particularly charismatic mini-fauna or microfauna in this exhibit. And I just want to start by getting a sense for how many people are local here. Okay, so we got a good number of local folks. Okay, good. So the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, often referred to as the GYE, for folks who may not be familiar with it, is it's in a class all of its own. And I think one of the reasons it's in its class by itself is the fact that 1, it's one of the largest intact temperate zone ecosystems left on Earth. And 2, because of that, it has this full complement of large predators. So think, grizzly bears and wolves and those sorts of things. Plus, it has the populations needed to support those predators. So, we have the largest free-roaming elk population here in Jackson Hole and the surrounding GYE area. We also have one of the last remaining wild bison herds. So those are the megafauna, right? Those are the animals that we all think about. But around all those animals and in between all those animals and weaved among them are these really important smaller species that we don't often give a lot of thought to, but that are so central to the ecosystem. So I'm going to highlight 3 of those, and if I can maybe turn your attention to the pika right here to start with. I'll just stand over here. So American pikas are signature montane habitats for a lot of different reasons. Now, who here has seen a pika? All right, great. And I'm guessing you maybe saw it in some rock piles in the mountains. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can't miss them. They've got this adorable squeak, and they're very charismatic. So this happens to be one of my favorite animals in the exhibit by far. And that's for a lot of different reasons. And one of the reasons is that they have this amazing strategy for surviving in these high elevation ecosystems. So most animals, when it gets cold out, most of those megafauna, for example, they either get out of town when it starts to get cold and they migrate south to warmer, easier environments, or they do what I would do, which is they sleep for the entire winter. These guys don't. These tiny animals that will fit in the palm of your hand are one of the few vertebrates that are actually active year-round, the entire portion of the winter up at these really harsh environments, up in the high alpine. So the way that they do that, the way that they're able to survive those periods without much food, is that they actually collect all the food that they need to survive the winter. They collect it in the summertime. And maybe those of you that have seen pikas, maybe you've seen these big masses of vegetation that they accumulate. And these are called hay piles. So the hay piles, I won't talk about them all day, but they are fascinating. So these hay piles that they collect, so first of all, you've got an animal that really fits in your hand. By the end of the summer, when they're finished collecting green vegetation, they will have accumulated enough food to fill an entire bathtub. So it's this huge, massive vegetation that they accumulate. And they feed on that throughout the winter. One of the other interesting things that they do, and they're, to our knowledge so far, they're one of the very few herbivores or vegetation-eating animals that do this. They actually harvest plants that are too toxic for them to eat in the summertime. They're extremely toxic. So plants have what are called plant secondary compounds, terpenes. They're things that protect the plant from being munched by grazers. So they're things that keep grazers from eating that plant. What pikas do is they harvest those plants that are so toxic that if they ate them at that moment, it would kill them. They harvest them in the summer. Those toxins degrade over winter and break down so that around January or February, when there's no fresh green stuff to eat, these guys have fresh food because all those toxins have broken out of that plant and they can eat it. Pretty amazing strategy that they're able to use. So these guys are going to have about two to three pups per year. That's an interesting trivia fact. A pika baby is a pup. Not all of those will survive. Pikas are actually a member of the rabbit family, so they have one of the lowest fecundity rates, or the rates of production of young of any member of the rabbit. I say rabbit family, technically the rabbit cousins, but they're related to rabbits. They're not related to rodents, which is what a lot of people think. So pretty low fecundity. As far as what they contribute to the ecosystem, so by making these hay piles, this is really interesting, by making these hay piles, they're putting a whole bunch of nutrition into the ecosystem that wouldn't normally be there, because as that vegetation breaks down, it infuses a whole bunch of nitrogen and important minerals that other animals need, and this is really critical in the high alpine where nutrition is fairly limited to begin with. So a really important way to have nutrient cycling at high elevations. So that's what I want to say about the pika. Maybe move from the pika, which produces 2, 3, maybe 4 young in a good year, to an organism that produces 5,000 to 10,000 eggs in a single go. So I'd like to move over to Picasso's toad right over here.
Amber, what is their lifespan?
Oh, that's a great question. So the question was, what's the lifespan of a pika? And a pika lives, we don't have good data on it, but we think they live 3, maybe 4 years. Pretty short lifespans. So this is Picasso's rendering of the toad. We have several different toad species here in Wyoming in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. One of the most interesting toad species is a member of the family Bufonidae, which is just a fun word to say. Bufonidae. Anyway, so the boreal toad is actually a toad that we find in this ecosystem, but they're particularly unique because there aren't many species of alpine toads. So you find the boreal toad in sort of wet meadows, stream areas, ponds, that sort of thing, from about 7,500 feet in this system up to about 12,000 feet. And what's really interesting about them, besides the fact that they lay 5,000 to 10,000 eggs per time, is that these toads, which feed primarily on grasshoppers, moths, a few other invertebrates, they spend over half of their time, half of the year, actually hibernating. Now, technically toads, because they're amphibians, they're ectotherms, they don't actually hibernate. They actually brumate, for anybody who's super into amphibians. They actually brumate, it's a hibernation for ectotherms. But anyways, in part because they spend so much of their time underground, they don't become reproductively mature until they're 5 to 8 years old. And toads, boreal toads, can live to be 30 years old, which is shocking to me for an animal that, while it's maybe a big toad, it's still pretty small when you think about it in the grand scheme. So a relatively long-lived species. In terms of what toads contribute to the ecosystem, they're kind of, they do a couple of pretty unique things. And one of them, as you may have heard, is that toads and other amphibian species can kind of be overall indicators of ecosystem health. So because they, remember I said they live near water bodies and they feed on these invertebrates, they're really closely tied to sort of the chemical function of an ecosystem. So when we start to see declines in amphibian populations, and specifically toad, salamander, frog populations, that can signal some ecosystem health issues. So they're a really good indicator of ecosystem quality around here. All right, last one. We'll move down to The Nest by Stephen Kestrel. I did, yeah, I did. This piece, entitled The Nest by Stephen Kestrel, depicts something that we don't get to see very often in the ecosystem, and that's organisms taking advantage, in this case, of a nest or a subterranean environment. So nests, dens, burrows, those are all really key ecological strategies that animals in this ecosystem use, because much like the toad and the pika, they have to deal with this huge environmental fluctuation in terms of both resources and in terms of temperature. So pictured here is a ground squirrel. Lots of animals use nests or burrows to overwinter. This can include ground squirrels, badgers, some North American rabbits, kind of a myriad of species. And oftentimes they use these for either sleeping for the whole winter, which again sounds great to me, or for raising their young in a protected space, one that's sort of predator-free or at least less exposure to predators, or from refuge from, say, inclement weather conditions, be it that wintertime or just in general when the weather's kind of crappy out. So an interesting thing about least chipmunks, so this is a ground squirrel, but we also have a number of chipmunks in this ecosystem. An interesting thing about least chipmunks is as they're creating their burrow or their nest space, they actually develop two primary holes in their burrow system. So least chipmunks are going to burrow down at least 3 feet underneath the ground, try to get below at least some of the primary temperature fluctuations that they would experience in the winter. And they're going to build their burrow down into the dirt, and they have these two separate holes. So one hole is what they call the work, W-O-R-K, the work hole. And that's where they dig and dig and dig, and they build this huge pile of dirt. Well, as you can imagine, if you're a fox or a badger or a predator coming along, boy, if you see a big pile of dirt, that's where you're going to go looking for something to eat. So the chipmunks know this. So they use the work hole, and they dig and dig and dig and dig and dig and dig and dig, make a big pile, and then they sort of form this little plug, this soil plug, and they shove it in the work hole, and that makes the predator think that the entrance is way over here. And then they sneak all the way back around, and they make their actual entrance, which is very small, really tiny, and difficult to see. So it's an interesting example of how they're able to sort of balance this need to have an excavated space with trying to avoid the risk of predation. Now, we often think of burrows as being used by small mammals, as depicted here, but there's also really interesting bird species that actually builds its nest inside of a burrow. And somebody said it.
Burrowing owl.
Burrowing owl, right. Burrowing owls are, has anybody seen a burrowing owl? Oh, they are
Adorable.
They are just an incredible species. So for those that haven't seen them, they're a relatively small member of the owl family. And they have this very unique strategy where they often use burrows that are built by other animals, like badgers or chipmunks or gophers. Sometimes they will excavate their own, but that's pretty rare. So anyways, they build their nests inside these burrows, and they do a couple different things, because once the female commits to laying her eggs and producing her young in this nest, she's not going to go out very often. She's going to make pretty few trips to be able to get her own food. So she actually, she along with her mate, actually stockpiles food for her to eat during the period when she's incubating her eggs and raising her fledglings and her young. So there's actually a cache inside one of these burrow nests, that had over 200 rodents in it, dead rodents in it, that she was going to feed on, which is pretty amazing when you think it's a 150-gram animal. It's really not very big. So that's a pretty large catch. And owing to the female's somewhat insatiable appetite, these owls have also developed a really interesting strategy where they carpet the entrance to their nest with feces of other animals. So like, you can think like bison feces or cow feces, not because they like the smell or not because they like the look, but because there are insects that migrate out of that fecal material that they can then feed on throughout incubation and the development of their nestlings. So it's a pretty fascinating strategy and a good example of how animals are balancing the need for food and raising young and avoiding detection by predators. So just a few examples of some of the unique characteristics of small animals in this ecosystem. So with that, what I would like to do, that was just kind of a brief overview of 3 species of particular interest to me in this exhibit. For the second part of this presentation, for those that are interested, I have a slide presentation that focuses largely on small animal, well, it mostly focuses on the understanding how animals can adjust to human-induced environmental change with a particular focus on climate variability in American pikas. So if you care to, I'd love to have you join us in the members lounge.
Thanks. It's pretty cute.
You saw the frogs back there?
Yeah, I love the frogs. So as I mentioned in our exhibit walkthrough, we of course talked about some of the charismatic mini fauna or microfauna, and we talked a little bit about their ability to deal with natural variation in the environment, right? Think about the pika that builds its hay pile, or the the burrowing owl that plans for its food needs by making such a large cache available to it. So that's all natural variation in the environment. I wanted to spend just a little bit of time talking about how animals are or are not able to deal with sort of human-driven change in the environment. And in particular, I'll focus on climate change because that's a very pervasive force of change on the landscape. Right. Okay. So climate provides this fundamental key piece to the ecosystem, right? It shapes temperature, it shapes moisture, and as a result, it has a really big effect on where we find animals on the landscape, how many animals are there, and how well those animals are going to survive. So climate, if you're a wild animal, is pretty darn important. And so as a result, species have developed these truly fascinating behaviors that allow them to take advantage of climatically linked variation. So for example, this bird has perfected the timing of its egg laying so that its nestlings hatch simultaneous with peak food availability. And its babies have a whole lot of food to eat. While this elk calf, for example, is eventually going to figure out the exact right time to leave its winter range so as to maximize consumption of rich green forage all the way along its migration route to summer range. So some pretty fantastic adaptations. Recent trends in climate, however, are placing some new challenges on some of these previously adaptive strategies. So in 2016, the American Meteorological Society came out with the State of the Climate. You can sort of think of this as the Earth's annual physical. And unfortunately, the appointment didn't go so well. So 2016 was the warmest year on record since the Society began keeping records around 1880. And 15 of those 16 warmest years have occurred since the year 2000. So there certainly seems to be at least some changing temperature dynamics that are happening. Now, I think it's easy, I like to think this, I think it's easy in Wyoming because we're surrounded by these vast landscapes and this incredible greater Yellowstone ecosystem to think, maybe climate change isn't happening here, we're such a resilient system. But unfortunately that's not the case. So this figure shows observed trends, so not modeled trends, but observed trends in temperature over the past, and the average January minimum temperature over the past 6 decades. So areas that are showing up in yellow and red indicate warming. So there's a couple things I want you to take away from this. The first is that climate change is affecting ecosystems statewide. And the second is that the high elevation areas shown in that bright red, may indicate ecosystems that are particularly at risk. And unfortunately, that is a considerable part of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So given the rate of change in high elevation systems, it's not a surprise that we're starting to pay some pretty close attention to animals that depend on those landscapes. So this wolverine, for example, which is a species that's featured in the exhibit, this wolverine, for example, requires deep snowpack in the spring in order to produce its offspring. While this moose, I mean, we'll let him in, he's a megafauna, but we'll let him in. So this moose requires access to cool areas, like cool riparian areas, in order to survive the summer heat, because they don't actually sweat very well. So moose actually can't deal with heat very well. So these are 5 species that are considered species of greatest conservation need here in Wyoming because of concern around their responses to warming temperatures. All told, there's 131 species of greatest conservation need in Wyoming, and about 35% of those are considered moderately, highly, or extremely vulnerable to climate change, and that consists of 6 of our 8 amphibian species, or about 75% of our amphibian species. So as you can imagine, with these shifting climate dynamics, it's not just the animals that may have a new challenge for themselves, it's also the habitats that they depend on. So, for example, warming temperatures have been linked to recent mountain pine beetle outbreaks, including in areas shown in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, in areas like Hawk's Rest. This is famously considered the most remote place in the lower 48. You can see quite a bit of beetle kill damage right behind the Hawk's Rest cabin. Warming temperatures have also been linked to an increase in the severity and frequency of fires. But I do want to be careful here because these patterns aren't just a result of climate change. Climate change acts in synergy with a whole lot of other stressors on the landscape. So it's also happening in relation to things like fire suppression and the restrictions that we've put on fire, basically. I'll leave it at that. So, this all seems pretty gloomy, right? Well, kind of a bummer. But, much like 12-time NBA All-Star Bill Russell, and pretty much anyone who played against him, there will be winners and losers. Now, in a basketball tournament of wildlife species, I wouldn't necessarily bet on the bullfrog. But, in the context of climate change, perhaps we should. So the bullfrog likes warm water and is expected to increase in distribution with changing temperatures. While the Canada lynx, which requires deep snow cover to secure its food, doesn't share that same rosy prediction. So climate change winners can expect population growth, range expansion, reduced competition, while climate change losers are looking at population declines, an increased risk of local extinction, and ultimately an increased risk of extinction for the species as a whole. So given these sort of species and habitat-specific responses to climate change, there's been a move by a lot of resource management agencies to sort of figure out, okay, if I've got a whole lot of species I have to deal with, how can I prioritize the ones that need my help most? So a lot of management agencies have moved towards these vulnerability assessments. I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about them, but I am going to tell you they're built on 3 things. Sensitivity, which is sort of intrinsically how sensitive are you to temperature, what are your physiological limits. Exposure, that's how much change are you experiencing. And then adaptive capacity. And this is the one I want to talk about because this is the one that is fascinating. So this is the ability of a species to cope with change in and of itself. The ability of a species to deal with change. And there's some surprising stuff going on as it relates to adaptive capacity. Alright, so the American pika, as we've already talked a little bit about, you guys already know so many interesting things about them. The American pika provides a really interesting model for trying to understand how this adaptive capacity, or the ability of a species to deal with change, how that may relate to its vulnerability. So pikas are considered heat sensitive. Temperatures above 25 C, that's like, what, like 78 or 80 degrees Fahrenheit, can be lethal to pikas in just a few hours if they're unable to seek shelter underneath the rocks where they can cool off or shed some of that heat. So we know that they're sensitive to heat, and really they have this heat sensitivity because remember they are active year-round in the alpine, so they've really developed this amazing cadre of adaptations for dealing with cold temperatures. That means they don't deal quite so well with heat. So we know that they're sensitive to heat. We know that they've been exposed to warming temperatures. Across the range, they've seen about a 4-degree increase in average annual temperature over the past 50 years. So they are experiencing some warming. But what we don't know about is how adaptive, what we don't know about is how well they can deal with this changing dynamic. And pikas are also interesting because we thought we knew their story. So in the early 2000s, there was a paper that came out that basically said, pikas are toast. They're done. They need these cold climates to be able to survive. They've got all these adaptations for the cold. So they're going to end up moving up the mountain, just kind of up the mountain, seeking out the cooler environments. They're going to get to the top, it's going to get too hot, and pikas are going to be gone. That was our understanding in the early 2000s. And so that, of course, engendered a whole lot of people really trying to look into it and understand more about them. And what we found is, yeah, that's true in some places. In some places where it's already really hot and dry, we are seeing those upslope range retractions that we would have expected. But in other places, we're not seeing that. And in fact, we're seeing them persist despite some pretty marginal habitats. So that really got us thinking about, well, what's going on? Like, why aren't we seeing this response that we were so confident about? Or in other words, is there something going on with adaptive capacity? And specifically, is there something going on with their behavior? Are they acting differently in different places? So that was the question that I set out to answer. And over from 2013 to 2015, I surveyed 10 sites here in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. If we have anybody from outside Wyoming, this rectangle is Wyoming. So the yellow dots highlight the areas where I conducted some of my work. And I used, we'll back up just a second. So we were talking about the hay piles that pikas make. For orientation, this is a pika right here, a little bit difficult to see. That's a pika right there with a load full of hay in its mouth. And this right here is its hay pile. Now that pile I probably took this picture in, might have been late July, so it's going to add quite a bit of vegetation before everything sort of senesces or becomes unpalatable in September. So you can see a camera positioned up here, actually fit each sample individual with 2 motion-activated infrared-enabled trail cameras. So every time a pika came by, it shot a video for me, which was great. And then I linked those videos with a temperature recorder that sort of recorded temperature constantly. So I knew exactly what the temperature was when these pikas were doing their different behaviors. And it worked pretty well. And I'll have to tell you, I don't know if artists go through the same process. I suspect they do. I didn't know if any of this was going to work, right? So I sort of set all these cameras and hiked, hundreds of miles and was like, well, I hope it works. And, hot dog, it did. So we, over the course of the 3 years, I got 4,300 video recordings. And that, after I sat down and coded a whole lot of videos, came out to about 7,800 instances of pikas doing something or being active at their hay piles. So a pretty reasonable sample from which we could start to look at their behavior patterns. Now, as a scientist, this is my kind of art. I don't blame you if you would rather look at, something prettier, but this figures are my kind of art. So I'll just kind of walk you through this so you can get a sense for what it says. So here on this horizontal axis, this part right here, we have the temperature, the mean daytime temperature, so the temperatures that pikas were experiencing. And here we call this the y-axis, or the vertical axis. We have how much food they're collecting. And as you can see, the warmer it gets, the less they're active. All right, well, we kind of knew that in the early 2000s, right? Like, that's not exciting. This is what they're doing as a population. As a whole, this is what they're doing. But if you look closer, these individuals are fascinating. So same thing here. This horizontal axis, this is temperature. This vertical axis here, This is their food collecting activity, but in this case, each line represents an individual. So each line represents you or me or the person sitting next to you. What you can see is, man, this individual, killing it when the temperature is great. I mean, she's just like going to town. Whereas, you know, this individual is going for the slow and steady, just the long, slow burn. So we've got a lot of different strategies going on, and that becomes really interesting. So I'm going to just introduce a scientific term for you. So the steepness of this curve, so this is a really steep curve. The steeper the curve, the greater what we call its plasticity, its flexibility. Just think about it as how flexible it is. So this individual, super flexible. This individual, not so flexible. So we were really excited about being able to document this amount of individual variation. Okay, great. So individuals do different things. Does it matter, right? Does it make a difference? Well, interestingly, it does. So the more flexible, the more plastic you are, the better your food is. So down here we have this plasticity measure, that flexibility measure, and up here we have the amount of nitrogen that you're getting. Now, if you're paying very close attention, you would have noticed when we first started talking about picas that I talked about how nutrient limited the alpine system is. Well, it turns out nitrogen in the alpine is especially limited. So the more nitrogen you can get, for me it's like ice cream, you know, the more nitrogen you can get, the better off you're going to be. So these guys that are, or girls, that are more flexible are getting more nitrogen. So that's a big deal, and that can facilitate persistence. So what do we find? Well, we find that sure, on a population level, picas decrease activity with increasing temperature. But there's a whole lot of cool individual variation going on. And the more the individuals can match their variation to that temperature profile, the better the food that they're able to get. So that all sounds pretty great, right? Picas are fine. We were wrong in the 2000s. Well, that may not be the case. So certainly they're more flexible than we realize, but I don't want you to walk out of here thinking picas are flexible, they're going to be fine. Because there also are limits, right? So if the temperature rises to the point that they can no longer shed heat under the rocks like we talked about, that's going to be an issue. If the temperature rises and it changes the plants that are available to them, so they no longer have those really nitrogen-rich plants, that also could be a problem. So yeah, they're flexible, and yeah, they have a whole lot more potential than we ever imagined. But they're not completely out of the woods. So I hope what I've been able to show you is that when we think about the vulnerability of all these amazing species that make up the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and all those incredible organisms that are featured in the exhibit, we need to think really carefully about their adaptive capacity or their ability to deal with change. Now just, last few final thoughts. I'm going to run through them right here so I don't have to walk back up to the computer. So a few final thoughts. Climate change is happening in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, whether we like it or not. It affects nearly all wildlife species, both mini and mega, and it's a new problem that requires that we start thinking about things in new ways, and that is exciting. I think if we're able to do this, and if we're able to follow some new ideas, and come up with some new solutions, we may be able to find a way forward that moderates exposure and promotes resilience among those species that have inspired scientists and have inspired artists for so long. With that, the science that I presented here was representative of a highly collaborative project. Some great agency folks I was able to work with, as well as some very generous funders, including some local folks with the Megabird Range Wildlife Fund, as well as the Teton Research Institute. And with that, I'll take questions if there's time or interest.
Hay pile? Yeah. My first thought was, what's keeping other animals from coming and eating their hay pile while they're creating it? In my head, when we first started talking about that in the gallery, I envisioned them putting all that underground.
Oh yeah, sure. That's a great question. Yeah, so picas here, they do stuff some vegetation into the cracks in the rocks. They do that a little bit, but by and large it's on top of the rocks, at least in this system. So with all those videos that we shot, we got a pretty good representation of animals that come into the pile as well. And you're right, there's a whole suite of other organisms that feed on these piles, though not to the degree that's damaging. And I I think that's because by being on these really rocky habitats, and I didn't talk about that much, but pikas are pretty much on talus, which is just like these big like rock and boulder fields. And not a lot of other herbivores, the plant-eating animals, are going into that system. So I think there's sort of like a spatial isolation to begin with. But on those videos, we did get a lot of wood rats that came in at night and either fed on the vegetation. I think they were mostly feeding on it. It was honestly kind of hard to tell. But yeah, so wood rats did a little bit. Deer that were coming along sort of the edge of the talus field, if there's a pile right there, they would sometimes go for that vegetation. But when you think about a deer, with its little legs, it's not going to be able to like, climb up the talus very easily to get to a pile. Let's see, what else did we document? Oh, this was sort of sad. I mean, not sad. It's the way an ecosystem functions. But one of our cameras was in an area that had, I don't know this, but I think a pretty good moth population. And so grizzly bears, as you probably know, will come through and feed on these moths in the summertime. They kind of rip up big areas to be able to consume these moths, are often underneath logs or underneath the rocks in the talus. And we did have a bear that came in and just ripped apart this picus hay pile. I assume looking for moths. It didn't eat the pile, but it sort of ripped it up. And it was pretty amazing. So this bear comes in, right? Like at first there's sort of like just this butt on the camera. I'm like, I wonder what that is. And it like swings around with a big old nose and some claws. I'm like, oh, I know what that is. And so then it goes in and just like shreds this pile. And probably, 10 minutes later, this pika comes back and it just starts like picking up the vegetation and putting it back on top of the pile.
That's a female.
Is there any way that we can see any of these videos?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd be happy to share them. I mean, I don't have any with me right now.
That's okay. Just if we can find them somewhere or have
Yeah.
access to them, it'd be really fascinating to see
Absolutely.
some of that.
I have some of them edited down so they're a little bit shorter.
Yeah,
maybe a little
perfect.
more attractable to watch. Yeah, for sure. I'd be happy to share them.
Cool.
Yeah.
Do the hay piles,
Oh, you're fine.
do they stay where they are all through the winter, or after they're dry, do they move them underground?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So no, at least in this ecosystem, pikas don't really do this drying behavior that I think has been sort of recorded in the literature in other systems. No, they build their pile and it stays there throughout the winter. Some winters they eat all the pile and you come back and there's nothing left. Other winters that are less severe, you come back and there's some vegetation left. But yeah, they all stay in the same spot right on top of the rocks. Yes.
I have two questions. One is, one of the first slides you showed had a pika with a forget-me-not,
Yeah.
and I was just wondering if they're eating that during the summer, or if that's one of those plants that has too much of the toxins in it that they're storing in the piles.
I don't know a ton about plant secondary compounds in forget-me-nots, but I will say that I have seen them consume it. So pikas, when they eat something immediately, we call it grazing, and then when they take it back to the pile, we call it haying. So I've seen them both graze and hay forget-me-nots, so that makes me think that they don't have toxins, but that's just kind of an anecdotal observation. I don't know for sure.
And the second question is just what predators are preying on pikas, and if any of those have been affected by a decline in pika populations, if there's a correlation between those
Yeah.
species.
It's a very thoughtful question. So the first part of your question, what species feed on pikas? A colleague of mine does joke with me that pikas are the hamburger of the wilderness. That hurts a little bit, but yeah. So they are sort of fed on by anything that can catch them. But they have some pretty unique strategies. So you think about, they're kind of like we talked about earlier. They're kind of living in maybe a less accessible environment. And then they also, if you ever watched a pika, they're incredibly fast, right? So you watch it and then it can, boom, be underneath the rocks in just a second. So they're able to move quickly, and there really aren't a ton of animals once they get into the rocks that can get them, with the exception of some mustelid species, like weasels in particular, because their long, slender body can sort of right into the rocks behind them. So in terms of actual declines of species that are feeding on pikas, I don't know of any, and I think that may be because it's not another really cool species pairing that you have in the exhibit is the snowshoe hare and the lynx. And we know that those are so tightly coupled, the population of the hare to the population of the lynx, so that you see those sort of cyclical population cycles. Because there's no species that's exclusively feeding on pikas, I don't know if we necessarily would see an immediate sort of cyclical decline of them. Yeah, good question.
I guess I have,
Yeah.
if no one else,
Yeah.
I'll always have lots of questions.
Yeah.
Has research been conducted on the percentage of plants in a mountain system that pikas are foraging on?
That's a good question. Let me think about that for a minute. Not specifically the percentages. We do know that they have a pretty a surprising breadth in their diet depending on where they're at. So if they're in an area where there's a lot of grass, they kind of just eat a lot more grass. They prefer forbs, but they can seem to accumulate enough grass to make it through the winter if they have to. So they do have quite a bit of dietary flexibility. I mean, they also, it's interesting because they also harvest a lot of shrubs, to sort of offer your question a little bit, but they also harvest a lot of like raspberry shrubs, and we think that they're maybe eating the leaves, but we also think that they're harvesting those to provide structure in the pile, because it's like thorny, you know, so it sort of makes this like interlocking plant structure that helps to keep the pile together. But I specific to like what percentage they're actually eating, I don't know off the top of my head. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah.
You think that the more longer growing season too would be to their benefit? The warm, maybe more grass than
Yes.
hay with.
I don't, that's such a, yeah, I've thought about that so often, and I don't know. I don't know if that ends up being an advantage, because, I mean, if you think about, all right, so maybe we get an earlier spring melt, that means those green plants are coming online sooner. That means that they can start, and other species that are sort of in this refugial state over winter, they can start eating sooner, which seems like that's going to be a good thing, maybe, for their, at least their production of young and the adult development. I worry a little bit about, so if we have these longer summers and warmer falls, you know, the vegetation is still going to brown down at some point. I don't know. It's a good thought. I don't know how it'll be. We'll have to check in 10, 15 years. Yeah.
Will you be going out this next summer and doing similar work or doing something different?
I'm going to try to do some similar work. So I have some grant application in with National Geographic right now to go out and to take a look at the long-term survival. So there was that figure that we showed where there were like some individuals that were really doing this like super aggressive harvesting and the temperatures were great. So I want to go back to those individuals and see if they're actually living longer than individuals that had that more sort of non-flexible strategy. Whether or not I do that depends on if that
In order to do that, would you have to tag certain animals?
Yeah, you have to have individuals that are identified. So we identify pikas and really lots of mini fauna by marking their ears, so they get kind of like little ear piercings. And those we use unique color combinations so we can tell one individual apart from another without having to go up and handle it again. It's kind of like, you know, large animals, we tend to use big GPS collars. That doesn't really fit on the microfauna, so we tend to go with more like ear tags. In some cases, you can use like backpack transmitters, radio transmitters on them. These guys are smart, and they ditch those transmitters every time. Every single time. They know how to pop them off on the rocks. And I think, oh. Yeah, but yeah, certainly that's my goal for the summer. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I know last summer there was a spotting of an albino pika on
Yes.
Delta Lake, and I
Yeah.
was just wondering if there are other sightings, and then is there other reported incidences of albinism in pikas?
Yeah, so there was an albino pika that I think got a little bit of attention in circulation. So I don't know if people know Steve Buskirk. He's one of the resident mammal experts in the state, just retired from the University of Wyoming. So I put that question to him: how common is albinism in small animals and pikas or other small mammals? You know, is it something that could be reflective of like a thermal strategy? Maybe if you're white, you're more reflective, and if you have a black coat, maybe you're more absorptive of ultraviolet light insolation, I guess. And he said no. he said it's a genetic mutation that it happens sometimes and we get fully albino animals, and he said it can actually happen across a broad spectrum of mammals. So he didn't seem to think that there was anything sort of evolutionarily going on with that, and it just sort of happens. I've also seen out of the bighorns, someone sent me a photo of a completely black pika, which is also a form of albinism. So there's completely white, no eye pigment, and completely black, and those are both considered albinism. I think it just kind of happens. I mean, genetic mutations, it just sort of happens. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you so much for this opportunity.